Viking Christmas by Tabib. In this age of jet aircraft and potential annihilation, it hardly seems possible that less than 20 years ago at least a dozen large sailing vessels used to spend Christmas running the Easting down to Australia. The Viking, in which I was serving, was a very well-found vessel, but like most of her sisters in the grain fleet, she was short-handed, and the crew were all looking forward to the holiday and the good food which we had been promised. The master said that on Christmas Eve there would be no work after coffee time, 3:30 p.m, apart from that necessary for the sailing of the ship, and on Christmas Day there would be a whole holiday. On Christmas Eve our watch, port, had the afternoon on deck. When we turned out, the weather was fine and sunny, and the ship was bowling along at about 10 knots. We were in high spirits, promising ourselves that at this rate we would be in Australia for the new year. Before coffee we had to clear up and wash down the deck. This gave us 2.5 hours to do it. Nobody was in much of a hurry. It was about 3 o'clock when the wind began to freshen, and threatening clouds spread over the sky on the port side. A young Finnish ordinary seaman and I were at the hand pump, and the mate was standing by giving an occasional hand. He was looking forward to the holiday just as much as any of us. Suddenly the mate straightened up, and after a glance at the sky to windward, gave 2 blasts on his whistle to call the watch and the order to take in the gaff topsail and flying jib. The flying jib hoisted on the fore royal stay had a tack about 30 foot long. It had to be hoisted this distance above the jib boom. Although called a flying jib in Swedish, it obviously does not correspond to the sail known by that name in English. Joe Cooper, the only other Englishman on board, held that it should be called a balloon jib. I believe the former nitrate carrier Pamir was the only other ship, then afloat, which carried such a kite. We hauled down the sail, and while one of the ordinary seamen and I made it fast, the rest of the watch went off to deal with the gaff topsail. All the time the wind was freshening, and what had at first looked like a passing squall now had every appearance of blowing up to a gale. As 7 bells had gone while we were out on the jibboom, we went down to coffee as soon as the sail was furled. Coffee usually consisted of some dark brown liquid, whose origin one could only guess, which served to wash down rough pieces of bread and margarine. On this occasion we found to our joy that the steward had produced some excellent biscuits, which were all the more welcome, as they were a surprise. After coffee, there were another 2 whistle blasts, this time to take in the royals. I was on the main royal with a long, lanky Islander named Borenius. In taking in the royals, there was always a certain amount of competition to see who could make the quickest and neatest furl. Borenius was a useful fellow to have with one, as he had exceptionally long arms, so we soon had the sail muzzled, and then furled well up on the yard. The Viking's royal yards had a span of 50 foot, and were made of steel. Although it was just possible for one man to furl the royals, whenever there were any wind in them 2 were usually employed. When the sails were fast, we were free to go below, but the mate told us to keep an ear open for whistles. The wind did not increase much, and we began to hope that perhaps there would be no further need to take in sail that evening. Most of the watch put on oilskins as a precautionary measure, and then we sat in the big cabin and chatted and smoked. Originally built as a training vessel, the Viking had been sold to Gustav Eriksson about 10 years previously, and had since been employed in the grain trade. For a sailing vessel, she had very fine accommodation, both for forward and aft, and the crew were housed in the cabins which had belonged to the petty officers in her training ship days. There was also a mess room and washroom, which were much admired by the crew of the Killoran. They had neither, who visited us in Port Victoria. One of them even offered me £5 if I would agree to change places with him. In spite of these advantages, the Viking was not a very popular ship among Grain Fleet sailors. She was heavy to work and far from being a smart sailor. Later, while serving in the old British foremaster Archibald Russell, I heard her described as a sailing steamship and a four-masted farm. This last epithet was a jibe at the hens we carried, and was also intended to take the wind out of my sails, as I was rather fond of singing the praises of my last ship. At 7 o'clock, when the muster was called, we clewed up the mainsail and crojack. The starboard watch, who had just had their Christmas supper, were on the mainsail, and we who were waiting for ours were on the crojack. I do not believe a sail was ever furled so quickly. The well-dined appearance of other watch acted as a stimulus, and we beat them without a doubt. In providing our Christmas supper, the steward had excelled himself. As usual in Scandinavia, of which we formed an outlying part, the basis of the meal was stockfish. In the dry state it is harder than wood, and the steward used to break it up with a hammer. After soaking for 2 or 3 days in soda, it is boiled. It is slightly gelatinous when cooked, and has not a great deal of flavour, but mixed with rice, potatoes and margarine in a sort of kedgeree, it is marvellously filling. There were all sorts of tinned things too, peaches, sardines, anchovies, and even a tin of asparagus soup. The finishing touch was a bottle of Dutch gin provided by the master. To appreciate what was really felt about it, one must first spend the best part of 3 months on an ordinary sailing ship diet of tinned mutton, salt horse, potatoes and ship's bread. Our appetite was sharpened, if possible by the knowledge that while we were eating, the other watch were taking in the upper top gallants. I made a corner in the soup, which seemed to be rather neglected in the general excitement over the anchovies. We all ate until there was nothing left. The gin, when shared out, came to 2 pretty stiff tots each, which we drank neat. After I had finished eating, I went out to have a look at the weather. It was blowing great guns, and we were still under lower topgallants in a wind in which normally we would have been down to lower topsails. Every sail and stay was straining to the utmost, and adding its quota to the uncanny noise of the wind. The ship was heeling steeply and charging with sickening plunges through a night that was black as pitch. Much of the optimism engendered by the good food seemed to ooze out of me on the spot, and I was convinced that there would be an all-hands call at any moment. I hurried back to put on my bad weather togs again and advised Jumbo and Big Finn, with whom Joe and I shared a cabin, to do the same. I was still struggling to get my sea-booted feet into my oilskin trousers when the expected 3 whistles came, followed by sundry admonitions to hurry up from the carpenter, who was chivying out the watch below. I made my way onto the forecastle head, where those of our watch who had already turned out were about to haul down the true-flying jib. The starboard watch, meanwhile, were busy taking in the lower topgallants. As soon as the halyard was let go, we all heaved mightily on the downhaul, and the sail came down without much trouble. But before we could get it smothered, the forestay sail began to split at the head. At once we started to take it in, but it was badly torn before we could manage it. It was the turn of the outer jib next. This started to split as soon as the halyard was let go, and then when the sheet was slackened, it gave a couple of mighty flaps and disappeared to leeward. It was so dark we did not even see it go. Wherever it went, the inner jib followed immediately afterwards. I heard later that the chief accused the second mate of having let go the sheets too soon. But that as it may, I know the second mate was roaring drunk and seemed to be having the time of his life. After making fast the remains of the jibs, we went down onto the foredeck to clew up the fore upper topsail, By this time the fore and main lower top gallants were furled, the mizzen had blown away, and Joe was having a lively time trying to make fast the thrashing tatters that remained. We had got the fore upper topsail yard halfway down, when suddenly the lower topsail split from head to foot on the port side. We could not leave the upper sail as it was, half clewed up, or it would have flapped itself to ribbons in no time, so the mate yelled to us to make fast the halyard and the clew, and clew up the weather side before turning our attention to the lower topsail. While we were hauling on the buntlines, I was watching the split topsail. Next it tore a little along the head as far as the outer buntline. The loose cloth caught on the buntline wire for a moment, and that checked it. Then suddenly, as it blew clear, it split right along the head, and in an instant there was nothing left of the weather side but the wire boat rope and a few stray rags. Clewing up the lower topsail was a comparatively easy job, as there was so little of it left. As soon as the buntlines were hauled tightly, the second mate, who was clad only in a pair of trousers and a yellow shirt, dashed up the rigging and out to the weather side of the yard to gather in the luff. The rest of us followed at a more leisurely pace, not sharing his enthusiasm. The middle buntline was not really hauled up enough, with the result that the foot of the sail, or what remained of it, was very difficult to reach, but we managed it somehow. As soon as the sail was furled, we trooped down from the fore-rigging and scrambled along the weather side of the deck to the mizzen-mast, where the other watch had started to clew up the mizzen upper topsail. By the time the effect of the gin and general excitement had begun to wear off, and we were all feeling exhausted, we were hauling in rather half-hearted manner when suddenly a donkey man started up a chanty. I did not understand the words, as it is in Finnish, but the tune was good and we started heaving in great style. The mate, however, did not like it and told the donkey man to keep quiet. The donkey man must have had rather more gin than the rest of us, because he replied that he would sing as much and whatever he chose, and immediately started on another vocal effort, which was most uncomplimentary to the officers. At once a furious argument started, and the master came along to see what all the row was about. It was unfortunate for the skipper's dignity that at that moment a roll of the ship, which should have caused him to lurch forward so that he practically fell into the donkey man's arms. The donkey man tried to push him off, but the master jammed him up against the pinrail and proceeded to read him the riot act from this position. Meanwhile, the mizzen upper topsail was doing its best to follow the inner and outer jibs. Fore lower topsail, mizzen lower topgallant, and jigger staysail, which had made its exit practically unobserved. It was the second mate who really saved the situation. He was almost as good at stopping rows as he was at starting them, and when drunk was superb. Barging in between the two struggling figures, he added his arguments to those of the master, and ordered the rest of the crew, who had been standing by watching the brawl, to get on with clewing at the topsail, and be quick about it. For 3/4 of an hour, all hands struggled to conquer the wind-maddened sail. The gale now seemed to have reached its maximum, and the canvas was stiff as plywood. First of all, both watches worked together in the bunt, and then when that was up on the yard, each went out to its own yard arm. Our watch had the weather side, but we were stronger, and after a tough tussle, we got the port side furled first. It was a hectic job, and despite the cold, the sweat was pouring off us. As we clambered down to deck, again I began to hope that at last we might get a little rest. The mate's yell of main upper topsail soon shattered any illusions I may have had on that subject. In a large ship like the Viking, it was not necessary to take in the topsails very often, so while overhauling buntlines we used to stop the topsail buntlines to the jackstay with several strands of rope yarn, so that there was no chance of them breaking out accidentally and necessitating another climb aloft. It was almost impossible to break them out from the deck either, so I was sent aloft to cut the rope yarns. I was almost blown up the lower shrouds. As I gained the yard, I made my way out along it with my knife in my teeth, cutting the rope yarns, holding the buntlines to the jackstay as I went. Then shouting to those on deck to lower away the yard, I climbed down to the lower cross trees to overhaul the sheet tackles. A creaking and groaning from above announced that the heavy steel yard was being lowered, and I could hear from the deck the faint cries of the men as they heaved on downhauls and buntlines. Making sure that the sheet tackles were all stacked, I waited in the rigging until the buntlines were tight. Then, as the rest of the crew came up, I climbed back onto the yard. As I was only an apprentice, several of the seamen pushed past me to get out of the yard arm, cursing me as they did so. Time and again we clutched at the sail, only to have it torn from our grasp by the next gust. Our fingers were sore and our arms were utterly weary. One hand for the ship and the best one for yourself is a good motto in calm weather. Perhaps, under these circumstances, it just did not apply, when the safety of all depended on each individual giving off his utmost. While we clutched at the straining curve of canvas, which reared and bucked in front of us, the wind howled in our rigging, and the rain beat on our oilskins, hard and cold. At last we got the sail muzzled. We could not furl it properly, but wrapped the gaskets around it and made them fast. Then, thankfully, our watch trooped down for the 10 minutes, which was left of our watch, below. It was 10 minutes to midnight. For those minutes I lay down on the deck utterly exhausted. I lit a cigarette but was too tired even to raise it to my lips until it burned my fingers. I had the first wheel in the next watch, and feeling more dead than alive, I staggered up for the master. There were 2 men at the wheel, and I was with the Finnish AB in our watch. He was very strong and a good helmsman, so although the ship was still tearing along and the wheel kicking like fury, things were not as bad as they might have been. Nothing much was done during the middle watch, and the lucky ones who had no turn slept. Somehow those interminable hours at the wheel passed. When 8 bells sounded, we turned in gratefully for our 3.5 hours' sleep, until 7:30 after working almost continuously since 1 the previous afternoon. At 8, when our watch came on deck, again the weather was quite fine and the sun was shining. The other watch had set the upper topsails and lower topgallants while we slept. At once we started bending on new sails to replace those lost during the night. The heavy work occupied most of Christmas Day. One bright spot occurred at coffee time, when the master called all hands aft and distributed Christmas presents, which had been kindly contributed by ladies of the ship's home port. I got a handkerchief and a shaving brush, and Joe got some fine warm socks. I cannot say how delighted we were with these tokens, to remind us of another world, a world where there were warmth and comfort and good cheer, from which we seemed incredibly far removed in our wind-driven home down in the roaring 40s.